Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. So the talk about inflation is still going on. We got a food price inflation report this last week, which talks about a 7.7% rise or something to that effect, projected for next year, which is the highest that this particular group has seen since they started keeping records. And it's creating a lot of talk about what the government, federal government, needs to do something about this. Do something. But there aren't a lot of tools in their toolbox to combat this particular issue. For example, they can't tell the Bank of Canada what to do around interest rates, but raising interest rates isn't going to do anything about the causes of this food inflation. And so the question I keep asking is, what exactly do you think the federal government should do? Should they implement wage and price controls? And that was kind of how I got as to thinking is maybe we need a reminder as to what exactly this is talking about. So wage and price controls were something that were first brought in during wartime in order to keep prices from skyrocketing because of supply shortages. Rationing and so on was part of this, but this is a tool that was used at the time. It got abandoned post-war, but then in the early 1970s, we were hitting a major inflation crisis, pretty much globally. There was global instability, and then the creation of OPEC forced kind of a global oil crisis. There was shortages, there was rising prices. Meanwhile, America had been expanding their monetary supply, and there was big inflation. We're talking double-digit inflation, which is a far cry from what we're dealing with these days. But in 1974, as a result, then Progressive Conservative leader Robert Stanfield suggested bringing in wage and price controls, and the Prime Minister at the time, who was Pierre Trudeau, kind of flippantly said, "How is that supposed to work? Do you just, zap, you're frozen?" And hence, Zap, You're Frozen was born. And it became this kind of mocking reply to the notion of wage and price controls. And yet, so Trudeau won that election, obviously. Then in 1975, inflation hit 10.9% in Canada. And Trudeau started to basically rethink his opposition to wage and price controls. And in that year, we saw the Anti-Inflation Act. So that pretty much implemented wage and price controls. So wages could only go up a certain amount in, I think it's companies over 500 employees and all federal public servants. There was price control, so prices could only rise a certain amount. And this was controversial legislation that got referred to the Supreme Court. And in 1976, the Supreme Court said, no, this is actually constitutional. And they only lasted, these wage and price controls only lasted a few years. It was in 1978, it was determined that they weren't really that effective, and in the following year they were repealed. But this is also where Zap, You're Frozen went from being a kind of mocking, your idea's crazy, to kind of a sign of hypocrisy that Trudeau mocked it and then still ended up going for it anyway. So why I think we should remember this particular lesson is just precisely what we're talking about these days with food price inflation. There's not a lot that the federal government can do about it, particularly because of the causes of this food price inflation. So what is driving a lot of the global inflation are the supply chains. Stuff is not getting to where it needs to be because production is slow in certain areas, or so on, and things are not matching up to demand, and that's why all these shortages are driving up prices. An example of this is semiconductor chips. So they're really necessary in the auto production sector. They don't have enough. That means there's not enough new cars. That means the new cars there are, prices go up. And also used cars, the prices go up because there's not enough new cars to satisfy demand. So prices keep rising as a result of this shortage of semiconductor chips. So similar things are happening in the food sector in terms of supply shortages, getting things from one part of the world to the other. But we've also seen a lot of droughts in food producing regions. Canada is no exception to that. The prairies had an awful summer for drought this year, and a lot of the food production of crops out there was down by about 30%, as well because of the droughts. They had to get feed for livestock from other parts of the country, which drives up input costs, which is partially why supply managed sectors like dairy are rising their prices so much, is because all of their input costs have risen as a result of these droughts. And droughts, we can always point to things like climate change as a result. And it's going to be especially bad in the coming year because of the flooding in BC, which has wiped out so much agricultural land, a lot of crops, a lot of livestock. That's going to reverberate through the chain for months and months to come. So again, shortage of supply means prices go higher. There's not a lot the federal government can do about that. And this is why I think we need to just kind of remind ourselves when we're demanding concrete action on inflation or so on, that we need to basically take a look at what is the driver for the costs and what tools does the federal government have. They don't have a lot of tools, but one of the tools they do have is wage and price controls. So I think this is one of these things that when we're hearing a lot of hysterical things, either in question period or on Twitter, about rising food prices and the government needs to do something, this is where I always say, do what? What tools do they have? Are you suggesting wage and price controls? And I also think perhaps it's time that the government ministers who are responding to these questions ask these same questions back. Do you think that wage and price controls are the way to go? Should we bring back Zap Your Frozen as kind of the rhetorical device to talk about or to illustrate this particular issue? Maybe. Wouldn't hurt. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.